Okay, so as I said, we're going to talk about exchange rates here this morning. A lot of that's review. Then we're going to be moving to talking about our short run macro model and how we can include exchange rates. That will probably take us through today. And then tomorrow we'll move on to topics such as the international global financial system, right? How countries coordinate exchange rates, and talk a little bit about trade balances and things like that. All right, so those will be kind of the big topics here to finish out our block. So it might seem like the end of class is far away, but it is short. Trust me. Okay, so let's talk about exchange rates. Okay. All right. So exchange rates and international macro. So when we begin here by talking about exchange rates, and the important thing to know about exchange rates is there's really two types of exchange rates that we have to be able to distinguish between: a nominal exchange rate and a real exchange rate. Okay, a nominal exchange rate is just basically the price of one currency in terms of another currency. So we're all, or hopefully somewhat familiar with nominal exchange rates. These are what get reported in the news, what gets reported in the paper. These are kind of what people pay attention to on a day-to-day basis, right? So if I say the US dollar is, or yeah, what is it now? I think the US dollar is worth about 0.9 euros, right? That would be an exchange rate. It's the price of one currency in terms of another currency. So I could say the dollar is worth 0.9 euros, or 1 euro is worth $1.1, right? They're essentially the equivalent way of saying the same thing. But nominal exchange rates aren't what really matters. And the reason we know this is, the key is the word nominal, right? Nominal means measured in current prices, but it's not nominal variables that matter, it's real variables. Real means adjusted for differences in the price level between two countries. So a real exchange rate is really the real price of one country's goods in terms of another country's goods. So the real exchange rate doesn't think about things in terms of currencies. It thinks in terms of the real price of a country's goods. Or another way that you could think about the real exchange rate is it's the nominal exchange rate adjusted for differences in the price level between countries. If you remember, let's see, what was it? The second day of class, we talked about adjusting for GDP across countries. If we asked this question, if you want to compare GDP across countries, how exactly do you have to do it? And so we talked about, well, you have to adjust for differences in population, right? Because obviously a big country in terms of population is going to have a much different GDP than a small country. We talked about adjusting for differences in the exchange rate, because obviously you can't directly compare dollars to RMB. But then we also talked about adjusting for differences in the price level, that $1 will actually buy you more in China than it would buy you in the United States. We have to adjust for differences in the price level. And so that's what a real exchange rate is. What is the real exchange rate? We'll call that RE. It's just equal to the nominal exchange rate adjusted by differences in the price level between two countries. So RE is the real exchange rate, capital E is the nominal exchange rate. And this is the relative price level between two countries. So here I'm picking the US and some foreign country. So all your nominal exchange rate is doing is you're just taking that nominal exchange rate and adjusting for differences in the price level. We did this, and we have been doing this when we compare GDP between countries. We don't just adjust by the exchange rate, but we also adjust by differences in the price level, right? We also adjust by differences in the price level. For any of you, you have done this in your head if you've traveled, right? I mean, I would assume most of us have probably traveled to another country. If you've traveled to another country, you have calculated a real exchange rate, you just don't know it. Because what do you do in your head when you're traveling? You'll say, you know, for instance, you go to Europe, right? And you'll say, well, there's a nice sweater. It's 40 euros. Well, how do I interpret that? First, I have to take those euros and transfer it into dollars. So I'll be like, well, 40 euros is probably like $45. And then you think about, well, what is the price of this similar sweater in the United States? And you might say, well, in the US, I could probably get that for 35 bucks. So this is expensive, right? So what you're doing there is you're calculating a real exchange rate. You just don't call it that. That's what we're doing here. You take the nominal exchange rate, and then you think about the relative price level between the two countries. That then gives you the real exchange rate, the real price of goods between countries. So to think about just one example, or this is a very simple example, but let's say that E, which is the dollar exchange rate, in other words, how many euros you get per dollar, right? That's what we call the dollar exchange rate. And let's say that this is 0.8. Actually, let's do a more realistic example because that's too low. We'll do something a little bit closer to where it is today. So roughly you get about 0.9 euros per dollar. Let's say that if you look at the price level in the US, a price of similar goods, that would be $100 in the US, and the price in Europe, or we'll call this, just to keep this consistent, call this PF, price in the foreign country would be 85. So what's the real exchange rate? It's the nominal exchange rate, 0.9, times the differences in the price level. Okay, let me find my calculator here. So by my calculations, the real exchange rate is 1.05. Notice how we calculate our real exchange rate. If you just go up here, it's the price of one country's goods in terms of another country's goods. In other words, it's a relative price. It's relative. So we have to think about this as the real exchange rate in the US relative to euro. So what does this mean? What does it mean if the real exchange rate is greater than 1? It means that the numerator here, this 100, is bigger than the 85. In other words, US goods are more expensive.
You know, honestly, you could probably get away with, well, no, it'd be
Than foreign goods.
also with hope.
Right? So if we calculate the real exchange rate to be greater than 1, it means that US goods are more expensive. US goods are about 5% more expensive, right? About 5% more expensive. And what happens if the real exchange rate is less than 1?
I have an idea.
Robin, I think you have your microphone is not muted.
Sorry.
Here, I can mute her. Okay. So the real exchange rate essentially allows us to think about the price of one country's goods in terms of another country's goods. So in this example, US goods are actually more expensive than foreign goods by 5% or so. And so this is a much better way to think about exchange rates, right? Is to think about not nominal exchange rate, but to think about the purchasing power, right? And so earlier in the class, we talked about the purchasing power parity exchange rate. And that's what the real exchange rate really is. And we're going to talk about that here more in a second. In fact, let's talk about this now. What determines exchange rates in the long run? Well, what determines them is this idea of purchasing power parity. And purchasing power parity is a pretty straightforward idea. It simply says the prices of similar goods should be the same across countries. Under perfectly free trade. If trade between two countries is perfectly free, then prices of similar goods should be the same. Why? Because of arbitrage, which is a word that probably most of you are, some of you should be familiar with. Arbitrage is just a fancy word for shopping. Arbitrage is taking advantage of price differences. And so the idea here is, what should happen if you have free trade between two countries? What's going to happen is that people are going to take advantage of price differences. And so over time, what's going to happen to those price differences? They're going to disappear. So similar goods should be the same across countries. So what if goods in Canada were cheaper than they were in the United States, and there was no COVID, and we had perfectly free trade between the two countries? Well, what would happen is, if goods were cheaper in Canada, Americans would go up to Canada, buy the goods, and bring them back. What's that going to do? Drive up prices in Canada, drive down prices in the US, and over time, those price levels are going to get moved back to being in equilibrium, right? Be back to being the same. So in other words, what should be true about our real exchange rate in the long run? It should be 1. The prices of similar goods should be the same across countries. Meaning, what also has to be true? Well, this has to be true, right? Because here's our formula for our real exchange rate. In other words, the nominal exchange rate only reflects differences in price levels. The nominal exchange rate essentially just reflects differences in price levels. That's why it's a nominal exchange rate. Taking this one step further, if we put this in growth rates, this is just the percentage change in the nominal exchange rate is equal to the percentage change in the price level in the foreign country. Oops, that should not be a plus. It should be minus. Minus the percent change in the price level in the US, or what should be true about nominal exchange rates? Movements in exchange rates reflect differences in inflation. And that is an important idea. In fact, when we talk about what determines exchange rates, this is the most important idea. Exchange rates in the long run primarily reflect differences in inflation. Differences in inflation rates are the driving factor of changes in exchange rates over time. So in other words, nominal exchange rates, their movements just reflect differences in price levels. If a country has inflation that's greater than the US, what's going to be true? The dollar exchange rate will go up. In other words, the dollar appreciates. And what happens if a country has inflation that's lower than the US? Then the exchange rate's going to drop, or the dollar depreciates. All right, pretty simple idea, but there's a lot of predictive power here. So the idea behind purchasing power, the implications of purchasing power parity, is that what is going to be the primary mover of exchange rates in the long run? Differences in inflation. Countries that have low inflation should see their currency appreciate. Countries with high inflation should see their currencies depreciate. And if you look at the data, you see this, right? This is reflective of what we see in the data. So let me just show you a couple of pictures here. First off, here's figure 20.1, the dollar versus the euro and the yen. Let's forget the euro here. The euro's in the red. Let's just look at the yen. Notice here that if we look at the exchange rate between the US and the yen, so this is the value of the dollar, the number of yen you get per dollar. notice here that since the 1970s, there's been this slow, gradual decline in the value of the dollar versus the yen. Now you'll see there's a lot of volatility here, right? And we're going to talk about that here in a minute, because as we're going to see, this is not the only inflation rates are not the only thing that impact exchange rates, right? But you see this kind of slow downward decline in the dollar versus the yen. Why? Well, look at inflation in the US versus Japan. And outside of a little blip here in the 1970s, you'll notice that inflation in the US has been about 1 to 1.5% higher in the US than it is in Japan. So what's the prediction of our model? If inflation is 1% higher in the US than Japan, what should on average happen to the value of the dollar every year versus the yen? It should depreciate by about 1%. And so that's essentially what we've seen, right? That over the long term, the decline in the dollar just reflects the differences in the inflation rate between the two countries. So as long as Japan maintains a lower inflation rate than the US, it will tend to appreciate. Its nominal exchange rate will tend to appreciate versus the dollar. Look at the US and Canada, right? So here's the Canadian dollar exchange rate, right? So the number of Canadian dollars versus US dollars. The purple line here is the purchasing power parity exchange rate, right? So that's the exchange rate that should hold under purchasing power parity. What do we see is true about the nominal exchange rate? Yeah, sometimes we're higher, sometimes we're lower, but if you look over the long run, that purchasing power parity exchange rate is pretty close. In other words, the price of goods in Canada and the US are pretty close to being equal in the long run. As I said, there's some other things that impact exchange rates that we're going to talk about. But in the long run, the biggest one is differences in inflation, right? Now, just to be clear, purchasing power parity, if you look back to the definition I made here, you'll notice that I made, oops, let me go back to my screen here. If you go back to my definition here of purchasing power parity, you notice I made the emphasis here under perfectly free trade. Because I want to make clear, purchasing power parity is not going to hold, at least not perfectly, if you don't have perfectly free trade. And in reality, there's a lot of things that violate this, right? Tariffs, quotas, right? So you would not expect there to be purchasing power parity between the US and Iran, for instance, right? Because we don't have a free trade agreement with them. So tariffs and quotas are going to be a violation of this. Transaction costs. Is purchasing power parity a better description of the relationship between the US and Mexico, or the US and, I don't know, let's say Uzbekistan? Okay, well, it's probably going to be better for the US and Mexico, because the costs of moving goods between the US and Mexico are very low. But the costs of moving between the US and Uzbekistan are very high. So even if there is a big price difference between the US and Uzbekistan, many people are going to say it's not worth it to go buy it in Uzbekistan and bring it back to the US, right? So it's kind of the same idea, you know, as to, you know, there should be purchasing power parity between Mount Vernon and Chicago, right? But it's not perfect. You know, for instance, gas is a lot cheaper in Iowa than it is in Illinois. Why doesn't everybody in Illinois just drive to Iowa, buy their gas, and take it back to Illinois? Well, that's pretty obvious, right? The time and the cost of doing that. is greater than the difference in the price. And so these kind of transaction costs keep purchasing power parity from holding perfectly. The other violation is that not all goods are tradable. Right? Not all goods are movable. So for some goods, there could be some quite big violations of purchasing power parity. The classic example is real estate. Because you can't buy a cheap house in Canada and move it to the US. Just like everybody in Chicago would love to buy a cheap house in Mount Vernon and move it to Chicago, but you can't do it, right? And so that means that goods are not necessarily going to equilibrate over time, right? If there are barriers to free trade. So, sometimes you see quite big deviations from purchasing power parity if you look for them, even between the US and Japan. We think about Japan as a country that has a lot of trade with the US, and it does. But here's looking at the real exchange rate in Japan. Here's the real exchange rate, to read this table carefully. The real exchange rate is based on 100, not 1. Okay, so they've multiplied this by 100 for some reason. So in other words, if the real exchange rate was at 100, that's equivalent to the price of goods in Japan being the same as they are in the US. But what do we see here for Japan's real exchange rate? Goods are consistently more expensive in Japan, right? Goods in Japan are more expensive than they are in the US. Why? In many ways, this is because Japan is not a free trade country, right? Particularly in the 1990s and 2000s, when a lot of the Japanese economy was closed, right? It was closed to imports and exports, so it was closed to essentially trade. You'll notice that as Japan has become richer and has gradually opened up a little bit more, its exchange rate has gotten closer to the purchasing power parity exchange rate. But it's not perfectly open, and as a result, we haven't seen its exchange rate fall, exactly to 1, or in this case, 100. Okay, so yes, sometimes you do see violations, but let me stress, even when there's violations of purchasing power parity, this idea that inflation rates are the big driving factors of exchange rates is crucial to understanding exchange rates, right? They just are. Right? The first thing you need to think about if you're going to think about what drives movements in exchange rates is you got to look at, well, what's happening to inflation, right? That's the big thing. Just kind of as an aside here, maybe I should have mentioned this a little bit before, but is a strong dollar, meaning an appreciating dollar, a good thing for the US? And the answer is, not necessarily. Just like a weak dollar is not a good thing for the US. So don't fall into this kind of nationalistic trap that I hear many people slip into when they talk about economic issues, right? That somehow an appreciation of US prices is good, and it's kind of like a sign of our national man or womanhood when the value of the dollar goes up. But we should just be very clear that a strong dollar is not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. A strong dollar helps importers. It helps people who hold US assets. But for the same reason, a strong dollar makes exports more expensive. And it hurts exporters. And it hurts the holder of foreign assets, because when the dollar appreciates, if you hold foreign assets, their value is going to go down. So like most things in economics, there is never anything that is universally good or bad. And so don't fall into this trap when you're thinking about the dollar exchange rate to thinking like a strong dollar is good and a weak dollar is bad. No. As I have written here, is a strong price for apples a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it depends who you are, right? And it's the same with the dollar, right? A high price of apples is not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It's going to help some people. It's going to hurt other people, right? And that's the same way with the dollar. right? So you don't fall into the trap of thinking that, you know, a strong dollar is really what policy should be shooting for. No, I think what policy should be shooting for is a dollar that reflects supply and demand, right? Reflects macroeconomic conditions. So, in other words, you know, the exchange rate, a good exchange rate is really one that balances many different economic conditions. Okay, so we've gotten through kind of what determines the prices of the dollar in the long run. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what determines exchange rates outside of differences in inflation, right? And particularly want to talk about what drives some of the short run movements in exchange rates. But maybe we'll take an early break. I don't know why today seems like a good day to take a little bit of an early break. It's Monday, it's hard to get going, right? So let's maybe just take a 5-minute break. And then I want to come back and talk about exchange rate determination in the short run. Okay, so I'll see you all in about a quarter till. Okay, everyone. All right. Do you guys have any big solstice plans tonight? Anybody going to be out dancing around in the woods, praying to the moon or whatever you do on the solstice? Supposedly there's like, I don't know if you've heard about, like, I don't even understand it. This Christmas star that you can only see like once every 50 years or something. Have any of you heard about this? I'm not seeing any recognition. Yes, there's some big astronomical event tonight that happens, I don't know, like every 50 years or every 100 years, or every time that the Browns make it into the playoffs. And so it's happening this year. Thank God. But anyway, yeah, so I don't know exactly.
There was a big one last night. I think there's a huge one last night, right, where Jupiter and Saturn lined up.
I mean, exactly. Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, yeah, everything lined up for the Browns to win last night. And so, yeah, I think you guys should all be outside celebrating tonight in one way, shape, or form. But yeah, I'll after class I'll send you a link to this star. But I think it's basically like if you go outside at between 4:30 and 5:30, like right at kind of dusk, you can see it. So if you're in Iowa. So anyway, I mean, this is what COVID has reduced us to, right? Getting excited about seeing one more star. That's big news. So anyway, all right, back to the mundane. So we talked about before break what drives changes in exchange rates, right? And in the long run, it's changes in inflation. What about in the short run? Well, in the short run, it's really interest rates. Why? Because asset trades drive most trading in exchange rates, right? Most trades in currency. So just so you know, trade in assets are about 25 times the trade in goods. And services between countries. So in other words, we've been talking about exchange rates as if they only matter for goods and services. But in reality, trading in assets is the most important thing, particularly in the short run. And when we talk about asset prices, we're really talking about the return on assets is a big thing that drives exchange rates, right? Differences in the return on assets, primarily interest rates. So the return on assets or interest rates are a very important factor in what influences exchange rates in the short run. And so how do we explain this? Well, really the theory that we have to explain this is a simple one. Called uncovered interest rate parity. We're back with this word parity again, which probably gives you some insight into what we're going to focus on here. Right, what is uncovered interest rate parity? Let's think about the return on a dollar asset, such as, let's say, a US Treasury bond. So that can be ID, and this is a nominal interest rate, okay, nominal interest rate. You could, if you were a saver, you could buy a dollar asset, or you could buy a foreign asset. So just like there's a dollar interest rate on holding money in a dollar account, you could also put your money in a yen account and get the yen interest rate. However, there's going to be something else that's going to impact your return on holding that foreign asset. And that is your return's not only going to only reflect the interest rate, it's also going to reflect any changes in the exchange rate. If there's a change in the exchange rate, that is also going to impact your return. And specifically, this needs to be a negative number. Why? Because if the exchange rate goes up, meaning the dollar appreciates, that means that the foreign currency is going to depreciate and eat away at your return. So this is the total return on holding a foreign asset. And notice how this is more complicated because now you have to incorporate exchange rate risk. And let me put in here, add. Notice that this is expected because we don't know for sure. We don't know for sure. There's that little e here, right? Meaning we don't know for sure what the exchange rate's going to be in the future. We have to say it's expected. So what does uncovered interest rate parity say? These should be equal. Okay. The return to holding foreign assets should be equal to the return of holding domestic assets under perfect capital mobility. And that, of course, is an important caveat. Because what perfect capital mobility basically means is that capital can move freely between countries. That capital can move freely between countries. So once again, we would not expect capital mobility to hold between the US and Iran. And so we wouldn't expect the return on Iranian assets to be the same as the return on US assets because there's way too many barriers. But what happens between a country like the US and Canada, where there are very few barriers in the movement of assets? Well, then we should expect the return on similar assets in Canada to be pretty much the same thing as a return on a similar asset in the US. And so uncovered interest rate parity just says interest rates should really be the same across countries, adjusted for differences in the exchange rate. Why do we call this uncovered? Uncovered is really because it's expected, right? So uncovered in finance lingo basically means there's risk that you're exposed to, okay? So notice that there is a risk of doing this, and the risk is we don't know what the we don't know what the future exchange rate's going to be. So by calling this uncovered interest rate parity, we're saying there's interest rate parity, but there is a risk that they're not actually going to be the same because it's possible that the exchange rate could change in unexpected ways. Now, there is something called covered interest rate parity. And with covered interest rate parity, you have a forward exchange rate. meaning you can lock into a forward exchange rate. We all know what we mean by a forward exchange rate, right? I mean, basically an option. So let's say that you were going to invest your money in Japan. You could buy the Japanese asset and at the same time purchase a forward exchange rate, a foreign option that guarantees you an exchange rate in the future. In this case, there's no risk because you've eliminated the risk by buying into a forward exchange rate. But a forward exchange rate has to be an option, right? It's not possible to get a forward exchange rate for every exchange rate in the world, right? So, you can get forward exchange rates between dollars and pounds or dollars and euros, but you're going to have a hard time getting a foreign exchange rate between, for instance, the US dollar and the Uruguayan peso, right? Because Uruguay is not a particularly big player in international financial markets. And so there's not a huge demand for Uruguayan pesos. And as a result, there may not be much forward market for these. But where forward exchange rates are available, you can actually lock yourself into this. How closely does this hold where capital mobility exists? Almost perfectly. All right, almost perfectly. Because it's so easy to arbitrage this. So this is part of what happens when we have, kind of electronic trading, is basically with the advent of electronic trading, what does, any financial institution of any size have? They essentially have computers that are out there looking for violations of this equation. And so, for instance, what happens if they find that even just for a brief moment, that's true? Then they will have electronic system set up in place that they'll borrow in the US where it's cheap, and they'll turn right around and buy a foreign asset. And they can do that and make a kind of riskless profit. And so you can imagine if every institution has a bunch of computers looking for violations of covered interest rate parity, how long are those violations going to last? Not long. In fact, nowadays, almost never, right? And so this relationship where there are forward rates holds almost perfectly all of the time. And it's just a reflection of how competitive financial markets are, right? Financial markets are extremely competitive. They have been for a long time. And with all of this electronic trading, this is the kind of thing that computers are perfect for, right? Because this doesn't require any thinking. It only requires speed. And so electronic traders are able to kind of trade on this all the time, and they do. And as a result, there's very few opportunities to actually trade on it, right? Because everybody's kind of looking for the same thing. Now, for our purposes, this tells us a lot about what drives exchange rates in the short run. First off, one of the things that's going to drive exchange rates is what's happening to the return on US assets, what's happening to US interest rates. What happens if interest rates in the US rise? Well, we can think about a very simple foreign exchange market here, where we have the price of a dollar and the quantity of dollars. And this is a big market, right? we have the demand for dollars, and we have a supply for dollars. Though the supply actually probably looks different because supply of dollars is really set by the central bank. In this case, it's because we're talking about the dollar, it's set by the Fed. That determines the equilibrium exchange rate. Okay, so in this example that we were talking about, what happens if the interest rate in the US rises? Well, that makes US assets more attractive, right? Because now if I buy a treasury bill or a treasury bond, I'm going to get a higher return. So what do I have to do to buy a treasury bill? First, I have to have dollars. That's going to increase the demand for dollars, right? And that's going to lead to an increase in the US dollar exchange rate. In other words, the dollar is going to appreciate. So when interest rates go up in the US, that tends to appreciate the dollar. That tends to appreciate the dollar. Hopefully this is pretty straightforward, right? Because this is essentially, straightforward supply and demand stuff. Just like return on US assets impacts the exchange rate, the return on holding foreign assets is going to impact the US or the dollar exchange rate. So here's our dollar market, foreign exchange dollar market. For some reason my graph is leaning to the left. Sorry. Okay, so here we are in equilibrium. What happens if, in this example, there's an increase in interest rates in foreign countries? For instance, there's an increase in the Japanese yen interest rate. Well, that's going to reduce the demand for dollars because now it makes holding Japanese assets more attractive. The reduction in demand for dollars should have just the opposite effect. The dollar should depreciate. The dollar should depreciate. Okay. So this is really just the flip side of the first example that we talked about, right? The relative return is what matters, right? What's the return in the US relative to other financial markets? What else could impact the value of dollar? Changes in risk, right? Changes in perceived risk. For instance, one of the things that's often seen is that the US dollar, and we're going to talk more about this tomorrow, is really an international currency. And as a result, it's often seen as what you could call a safe haven. When people want safety, they tend to move to US financial markets. And so if there's an increase in global risk, whether it's from the pandemic or whether it's just from, political volatility or whatever, not always, but you typically see an increase in the demand for dollars, and the dollar tends to appreciate. Right? So the dollar tends to appreciate during periods of global risk because the dollar is a safe haven. And as I said, we're going to talk more about this tomorrow, the kind of special role that the dollar has in the global financial system, right? The US has huge advantages when it comes to international macro because of the special role that the dollar plays. Let me talk about one more thing that could impact exchange rates. Expected changes in exchange rates in the future. Future changes also impact today's exchange rate. So here's today's exchange rate. And then let's think about an example where people think the dollar is going to appreciate in the future. Well, if the dollar is going to increase in the future, what do people today want to do? They want to hold more dollars. You want to hold the dollar before it appreciates. You don't want to hold it after it appreciates. Of course, what does that mean? That means that the dollar appreciates today. Or to put this in another way, if people think the dollar is going to appreciate in the future, it appreciates today, right? And this is something that we know about how markets work. Prices instantly reflect all new information. So it's the new information that matters. So if the market thinks that exchange rates are going to go up in the future, what happens? They go up right now because the price is instantly reflecting what you think is going to happen. It is reflecting all new information. So if you read the foreign exchange column in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, what are you going to see discussed in there on a day-to-day basis? You will see inflation, both in the US and in other countries, because differences in inflation rates play big roles in exchange rates. Interest rates, you will see tons of discussion about what's happening in interest rates in all the countries of the world. Risk, because risk is one of the fundamental factors that influences exchange rates. And then you're also looking to the future, right? You're also thinking about, well, what's going to happen to interest rates and inflation and exchange rates in the future, not just today, right? So that is really, you know, if you're a follower of the exchange rate market, those are really the things that you focus on the most. Having said that, there's a small number of things, that's not to underestimate how complicated these markets are. Because remember, these aren't just things in the US that matter. Things in every country of the world matter, right? So it's not just inflation and interest rates and risk in the US. It's inflation and interest rates and risk in every other country of the world is going to play some value or play some role in what's happening to the dollar. So, you know, there's a lot that goes in these. These are big, complicated markets. And so, you know, this is not for the faint of heart, right, to be speculating in these markets, because there's a lot of stuff that goes around. I do want to make a key, emphasize a key point here that I don't want to get lost in our discussion. And I'm not sure that I've made this as clear as I need to make this. A rise in interest rates may or may not increase the exchange rate. Wait, didn't I just say that a rise in interest rates does increase exchange rates? Not necessarily. If the rise in exchange rates is caused by a rise in inflation, then the dollar is actually going to go down, right? If higher U.S. inflation is what pushes up interest rates, then the dollar is going to go down. However, if it's an increase in the real interest rate that drives up the value of the U.S. in nominal interest rate, then the dollar is going to appreciate. Okay? So in other words, just looking at nominal interest rates doesn't tell you what you need to know. You need to look a little bit deeper than that. You need to think about what is driving the interest rate exactly. Is it inflation? Then you get one answer. Is it the real interest rate? Then you get a completely different answer. Okay, does that make sense? And so I think that's one thing that many people are, that's easy to confuse, right? Higher interest rates aren't always going to drive up the value of your currency, particularly if those higher interest rates are being driven by inflation. Just to kind of recap this, your book has a couple of interesting figures that we can kind of look at here to kind of think through all this. Let's look back at, here we go, figure 20.1. And here I want to look at the dollar and the euro. So the euro is the red line there. And notice the incredible volatility of the euro, right? The euro has fairly regularly increased by 30% and fallen by 30% versus the dollar. I mean, the euro, since its creation in the year 2000 has been all over the place. And we can kind of think through why this is. First off, why initially did the euro, I'm sorry, so this is euros per dollar. So this is actually the dollar exchange rate. Why initially did the dollar appreciate so much against the euro, right? If you see here in 2000, the dollar had a big appreciation versus the euro. And the reason is that interest rates in the US were much higher than they were in Europe. And so the dollar really depreciated. But then that turned around basically in 2002. And basically the US had a recession in 2001. And in late 2001, and as the recession hit, interest rates in the US went down, and then you saw this long decline. Also, inflation in the euro has generally been a little bit lower than in the US. So the long decline in the dollar from the early 2000s till about 2007 really reflected the fact that inflation was lower in the US and interest rates were lower in the U.S., in part because of not great economic growth. Interestingly enough, the 2008 global financial crisis kind of changed things. And since 2008, the dollar has typically appreciated. Why? Well, part of this is, once again, that safe haven argument. The global financial crisis took place in the U.S., and you think, well, wouldn't that make people get out of the U.S.? The fact of the matter is it also hit Europe very hard. Europe also had the Greek debt crisis that went on in 2009 and 2010. And so many investors said, really, U.S. is a safe haven relative to Europe. And so a lot of investors got out of Europe and they moved to the U.S. And that kind of started the appreciation of the dollar. And that's generally kind of continued throughout the 2000s and 10s as growth in the US has been stronger in general than growth in Europe. So, once again, you kind of have to understand these multiple factors to understand movements in the exchange rate. I don't have a graph to show you. I guess I could pull one up, but I don't even think I need to. I can just tell you that another interesting case study is what's happened to the value of the dollar versus the British pound. And what's happened over the last couple of years is that the dollar has appreciated greatly versus the British pound, right? Basically, the pound is at, 40 or 50-year lows against the dollar. We're almost down to $1 to 1 pound, which is a value that has never really been seen before. And why? A lot of this has to do with Brexit, right? As Britain gets out of the European Union, a lot of investors are looking at Britain and saying, I don't like their growth possibilities. I don't like the risk. I don't like the political instability. I'm getting out, right? And so the pound has depreciated a ton versus the pound. Also, interest rates in Britain have really dipped. And so once again, the relative reduction of interest rates in Britain has once again kind of chased investors away. And so, these kind of little brief case studies just illustrate the importance of understanding inflation, understanding interest rates, and understanding risk, right? Those are the things you really got to understand if you're going to kind of interpret movements in exchange rates, which can be very, very complicated. Okay. So anybody got any questions about that? About exchange rates? So in the last half hour of class or so, I want to move on to, this is all fine and good, and I suspect many of you are kind of like, oh yeah, I remember this stuff. It's all coming back to me a little bit, right? But how does this fit into the other things we've been talking about this block? Specifically, how can we put this in our short-run macro model, right? How do we incorporate exchange rates and global finance and global trade into our short-run macro model? So let's talk about that. And I do think that there's actually some relatively simple ways that we can incorporate many of these facts, maybe surprisingly simple ways that we can incorporate some of these phenomena into our model. Sorry. Okay, so let's develop a version of our short-run macro model, and I want to focus here specifically on a small open economy. So let's not think about the US for a moment. Let's think about a small open economy. What would be a good example of a small open economy? Canada. Canada would be a good example of a small open economy. Right? Open to trade, but here is the key. Canada is not big enough to impact global interest rates. So we can think about a world in which there's the domestic interest rate is something different than the global interest rate. And you might be able to see now, if this is the model that we want, why this isn't necessarily directly applicable to the US. Because for the US, there's not such a clear distinction between the domestic interest rate and the global interest rate. Because the US financial system is such a huge part of the global financial system, that when interest rates in the US change, what we tend to see is interest rates everywhere change because of the incredible influence of the dollar. So think about this as an extreme example, okay? And then at the end, I'm going to say this gives us this still gives us some insight into the US economy. But to think about an extreme example, we'll just kind of maybe make the comparison between our previous model and this model a little bit more clear. Okay? So once again, we have an IS curve, right? Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus net exports. Net exports is X minus M, exports minus imports. Now, here's the part that we want to think about. This net export part. Because that's the global part. What determines net exports? The exchange rate. When the dollar appreciates, this is going to make US goods more expensive and foreign goods cheaper. And so that's going to tend to reduce exports, increase imports, and reduce our net exports. Now, what determines the exchange rate? In the short run, what's the main thing that determines the exchange rate? RT, the real interest rate. So the real interest rate determines the exchange rate. The exchange rate then determines net exports. So think about a model this way. What if we model net exports in the following way? This is as before. This part of it is the same as before. This is exogenous. There's an exogenous part of net exports that's dependent upon our trend output. This is the new part. And what this allows us to incorporate into our model is that exchange rates and the real interest rate impact net exports. What happens if our interest rate are greater than world interest rates? This appreciates the exchange rate and it reduces net exports. And what happens if real interest rates are below world interest rates? This depreciates the exchange rate and increases net exports. Okay, we see how that works? Let's be clear here. There's a couple of very important exogenous variables here that we need to be clear about. RW is the world interest rate, and this is exogenous. Why? Because remember what we said at the beginning. We're talking about a small open economy here. In other words, we're talking about Canada. Canada has no influence on what that world interest rate is. And so they treat that as exogenous. So that's an important exogenous variable here in this model. There's also another important exogenous variable, V bar NX. And you can think about this as the sensitivity of net exports to changes in the real interest rate and the exchange rate. So how sensitive are net exports to changes in the exchange rate? Do net exports change a lot? Are they elastic? Right? An increase in this means it's elastic and you get a bigger change in net exports. Okay, everybody with me so far? So, if this setup looks at all familiar, it is. This is actually a very similar setup to what you were asked to do in exam number 2, right? Remember in exam number 2, what question was that? I think it was question number 2, where I said, imagine a consumption function now that's based on interest rates. Well, now I'm asking you, this is essentially the same setup. Now it's net exports that are based on interest rates, right? It's very similar to that same setup where now interest rates don't just impact investment, interest rates impact net exports. So I'm not going to do all of the math here, but what you can do is you can plug this new net export equation. Man, I can't write this one. I really can't write. So plug this new net export equation into y equals c plus I plus g plus net exports. The rest of the model is the same. Simplify. In the interest of time here, I'm not going to do all this algebra. But what do you get? You get this, as I said, this is very similar to the answer that the question that you had in homework, or sorry, exam number 2. However, there is one difference. What's A bar? A bar looks just like it did before. But there's one other thing in A bar. There's this extra term. There's this extra exogenous term in here that's related to the world interest rate. Because notice up here in our IS curve, Where does the world interest rate go? It actually goes into A bar. We just put the world interest rate in here with A bar. So now there's two big differences. The first is the IS curve is flatter. Because you have multiple effects now of a change in interest rate. This makes our IS curve flatter because now there's two things that impact the slope. Very, very similar to the impact on, once again, on that question on your last exam. Because what happens now when interest rates change? Interest rates don't just change investment, they also change the exchange rate, and the exchange rate changes net exports. So now changes in interest rates have a bigger impact. Oops. Changes in interest rates now have a bigger change in short run output. Because now there's this net export effect. The other big difference is now notice a change in world interest rates can be an aggregate demand shock. What does an increase in world interest rates do? An increase in world interest rates essentially, oops, wrong. In this model, an increase in world interest rates reduces your exchange rate, increases the net exports, and increases aggregate demand by increasing A bar. So we have a new type of aggregate demand shock here. And that aggregate demand shock is the world interest rate. So when there's an increase in the world interest rate, that essentially becomes a positive aggregate demand shock for a country. Likewise, what happens if world interest rates go down? If world interest rates go down, that becomes a negative aggregate demand shock because it's going to tend to appreciate a country's currency. So let's talk about each of these. In a little bit more detail, just so that we make sure that we understand the fundamentals of what are going on here. So, sorry, things keep on popping up. How is, for instance, tightening monetary policy different in our model than it was before? Well, it's different because our IS curve looks different. That's what an IS curve would look like in a closed economy. But what's it going to look like in an open economy? It's going to be flatter. So what happens if the Fed raises interest rates? Notice that output is going to fall by more in an open economy than a closed economy. Why? Because you have this extra effect. So in an open economy, you don't really have to think about net exports, at least in the model that we work through. Or I'm sorry, in a closed economy, you don't have to think about net exports. But in a more open economy, changes in net exports becomes a bigger factor here. In many ways, monetary policy is more powerful in an open economy because there's another avenue through which monetary policy works. It doesn't just work through investment, but it also works through exchange rates, changing exchange rates. Once again, you know, there's a reason why I gave you that question on the second exam, because that question on the second exam, I think in many ways, that's a very, very similar idea to what we've introduced here by having an open macroeconomy modeled as we have. Let's look at one more example here. Oh, let's do this opposite example. Let's say that world interest rates go down. What impact does this have on our small open economy? This is a reduction in A bar. Aggregate demand goes down and aggregate supply. I'm sorry, aggregate demand goes down, our IS curve goes down. So this is a very typical aggregate demand shock, IS shock. IS curve falls. What happens in this model? Well, at least initially, short run output falls. Should be in blue there. Short run output falls. And then, of course, we won't go into this now, but remember, over time, aggregate supply is going to shift back, right? To move us back towards zero. But this starts off the whole counterclockwise movement thing. Between inflation and short run output. So yeah, for a country like Canada, really, I think maybe the important thing to notice here is that other countries' monetary policy can serve as a source of aggregate demand shocks. And that's the trap that many small countries find themselves in, is they find other countries are essentially creating aggregate demand shocks for them by changing monetary policy, right? So here's a huge complaint that many small open economies like Canada, the Bahamas, countries that do a lot of trade with the US and are very, very sensitive to the dollar exchange rate. This is their complaint, is the US, by only focusing on itself and cutting interest rates, has done what? It's essentially given other countries this series of negative aggregate demand shocks, right? It's essentially served as a source of big aggregate demand shocks. Many countries have essentially called this what used to be known in the old days as beggar your neighbor. Basically, undercutting your own exchange rate to increase your exports and make your economy do better. In other words, beggar thy neighbor is another word for screwing your neighbor, right? And so for a lot of countries, they really see U.S. monetary policy as just an example of the U.S. focusing only on U.S. interests and not thinking about anybody else, that they're essentially playing a game of screwing your neighbor, right? Cutting interest rates, depreciating their currency, and makes U.S. exports cheaper, but of course it really hurts these other countries' exports and serves as a series of aggregate demand shocks for them. So, you can see just by changing this model in kind of a simple way, you can get quite complex trade-offs here in monetary policy, right? And you can see quite complex interactions between countries. How should we then think about the U.S. economy? Is the U.S. economy a closed economy like we talked about last week? No, we're not closed. Are we a small open economy like Canada? No, because interest rates in the U.S. do impact global interest rates. So where is the U.S.? Well, you kind of have to think about the U.S. as being a compromise. It's halfway between the model we talked about last week and the model we talked about today, right? If the U.S. pushes up interest rates, will that also push up world interest rates? Yes, but not on a one-to-one basis, right? It will push up world interest rates a little bit, but it's not going to push them up, as I said, on a one-to-one basis. So if the U.S. increases interest rates by 1%, it's not going to drive world interest rates up by 1%. So you have to think about what's true about the U.S. is it's kind of true what we talked about here, but just less so, right? Less so. If the U.S. increases interest rates, that will increase interest rates above the world interest rate, but not a ton above the world interest rate, because the world interest rate will also adjust. So, you kind of have to think about the U.S. case as something like an intermediate. Though, if I had to pick one, you have to argue that the U.S. is more like in many ways, the U.S. is more of a closed economy than an open economy. And I say that simply because exports and imports are a relatively small fraction of U.S. GDP. So, the things that the U.S. has to think about in monetary policy are actually much simpler than what a country like Canada has to think about, because Canada, by being a small open economy, really has all these global issues that it has to be much more cognizant of when setting monetary policy. And so that's really where we're going to turn tomorrow is, how do you incorporate exchange rates into setting monetary policy? How should a country manage its exchange rates? What are the options? So we'll talk about fixed exchange rates, floating exchange rates. We'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages of both. We'll talk about the policy trilemma, if you remember that from other macro courses. So, once again, a big chunk of what we're going to talk about tomorrow is going to be, largely review, but I think we'll try to go a little bit deeper into thinking about how exactly exchange rate policy works. All right, so that's the end of class here this morning. We don't have class this afternoon, right? Congratulations. So spend that time working on homework number 5. I'll be around if you want to talk or send me an email. I'll be there. If not, remember homework number 5 is due at 8 in the morning, okay? And what are we going to do tomorrow? In the morning, we're going to finish up chapter 20. And then my hope is I'm going to try to grade your homeworks over lunch. And we will have class tomorrow afternoon. But my hope is that all we will do is review tomorrow. We'll review homework number 5 in the afternoon. and then we'll talk a little bit about the final exam. Okay, so that's kind of the agenda tomorrow. So, and I'll send you an email about that here in a few minutes. Okay, thank you very much for your attention, everybody. Hang in there. We're getting to the finish line. All right, see ya.
Hey Todd, at the beginning of class, you went over number 4 of the homework. You were just answering someone's question about
Yeah.
about what he had. I kind of missed it. Do you mind just telling me that again?
Yeah,
Real
so
quick.
this was question number 4, part B.
Okay.
And so I had just kind of mangled my wording of this, particularly this sentence. It should read, what price would a Burmese worker be willing to pay to be better off by migrating to Korea? Didn't mean to stop sharing that.
Oh no, it's all good.
Did you get it?
I wrote it down.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Anytime. See you, Ian.
Yep. See you later.